My talk today is Children in Art, and I've selected works from the whole history of Western art to show various aspects of childhood, and all the images I'm going to show chronologically. Now, the modern idea of childhood was invented in the 18th and 19th century, and paintings like this one by John Everett Millais, My First Sermon, helped create the modern idea of childhood. And before then, children were just seen as young adults and rarely shown in art, with one exception I'm going to show you over 3,000 years ago, perhaps the most startling image I'll be showing you today. It's this. Now, the art of ancient Egypt is normally regarded as unchanging for 3,000 years, and mostly it was. Most of it was funerary art and concerned with ceremonies to ensure the dead passed over to Aru, the field of reeds, which is was their paradise. However, there was one short 18-year period when art and society changed radically. That was the reign of Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti, and they're shown here playing with their children. This type of image was unheard of in Egyptian art before and after this brief period. It's difficult to describe just how unbelievable this is. It's almost as if Akhenaten came from another world. For example, the Egyptians had hundreds of gods and goddesses and had done for 1,000 years, unchanged. Akhenaten did away with them all, except for one, the sun god Aten, shown here, shining its rays down on the happy family. You can see Akhenaten almost kissing his daughter, while his wife holds another daughter on her lap, while a third strokes her cheek. Akhenaten changed everything, changed religion fundamentally, removed the power from the all-powerful priests, built a new city, Amarna, from scratch, changed the art, but he only reigned for 18 years, and a few years later, 3 years later, after his death, was the reign of the now famous pharaoh Tutankhamun, and Tutankhamun reinstated all the old gods, moved the capital away from Amarna, and almost completely erased Akhenaten from history. By the way, before I move on, I'm sometimes asked about the elongated heads of his daughters. It's believed that they are purely stylistic. They're not inherited or a genetic deformity. 1,000 years later, we find children represented in Greek funerary art. This is a gravestone of Philonoe. A nanny holds the baby that reaches out to its mother, and we know from the inscription the baby has just died. The baby reaches out but cannot reach the mother. There's a 3mm gap between them, representing the unbridgeable gap between life and death. Children were represented in Greek and Roman art, but mostly in funerary monuments or sometimes mythological figures like Cupid, like this one. This is sleeping Eros, the Greek child god of love. In Roman mythology, Cupid. Children were also sometimes shown in scenes playing with each other, or even sometimes playing with pets. This particular statue of Eros sleeping is the finest example known. It's at the Met in New York. There were many replicas built. It was very popular, this particular statue, in the Greek Hellenistic and the Roman period. And the Romans often used this particular statue or copies of it to decorate villas, gardens, fountains, and so on. So representations of children were known but not common. However, there is one child, of course, that's represented thousands and thousands of times. The infant Jesus, shown here in the earliest representation of the Virgin Mary, shown here with the infant Jesus. It's in the catacombs of Priscilla in Rome. We believe the figure on the left is the prophet Balaam, pointing to a star which is outside the frame here. And of course I'm showing you here the first image of the infant Jesus, but there are literally thousands and thousands, of course, of images of Jesus. But I'll just show you just one that I've selected. I've tried to select images which are a bit unexpected or a bit unusual. This one is 400 years after the previous one in the Priscilla catacombs. It's a Byzantine religious icon showing the Virgin Mary holding Jesus, sitting between, on the left, Saint Theodore, and on the right, Saint George, each holding martyrs' crosses. There are two angels behind, looking up towards God, whose hand can be seen coming down from heaven, top centre. Now, the interesting thing, I think, is that the saints are presented frontally, but the angels' heads are well modelled in 3 dimensions, as is the Virgin's face has a realistic appearance. And this is early Byzantine. We believe it's around about 6th century, early 6th century. And it's a mixture of classical and iconic representation. Remember, Constantinople was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, and they regarded themselves as continuing the classical tradition in art. So it's a combination. Mary and Christ are averting their eyes. They're not looking at us directly, but the saints are staring at us. And I believe this is represents a conduit through the saints to Mary, and through her to up to the heavenly realm. In other words, it's a liminal space, a gateway from the everyday world to the spiritual world. Now, there was another important reason for showing children art, but we need to jump forward 1,000 years to an image that you've probably seen many times in Hampton Court. And the reason for showing the child here is succession to Edward. Henry VIII was desperate to carry on the Tudor line, and here that role falls to Edward, shown on his right. And he has his hand resting on Edward's shoulder, and on the other side, Edward's mother, Jane Seymour. And to emphasise the importance of succession, that this is about succession, it was painted in 1545, roughly, we believe. Jane Seymour had already been dead 8 years, and his then wife was Catherine Parr, who's not even shown in this picture. His daughters are shown. Princess Mary is on the left, and Princess Elizabeth on the right. Now, you might be wondering who the figures are lurking outside. They are the court fools. The woman on the left, whose attention seems to have been taken by something in the distance, is probably Jane Fool, or Jane the Fool. Fool to Anne Boleyn, Princess Mary and Catherine Parr. She's in the garden of not Hampton Court, of Whitechapel, Whitehall, I should say, Whitehall Palace. And you can see a typical Tudor garden outside. It's got square enclosures surrounded by low fences, and in the centre of each enclosure there's a pole with the Tudor colours, green and white, and on top of the pole is one of the king's heraldic beasts. And within the low fence there would be a bed of flowers. If you look on the other side, the man in red hose is the King's Fool, Will Summers. He's got a monkey on his head checking for lice, and the inclusion of the fools shows their importance within the royal household. They were one of the few who were allowed to speak truth to power, as we would say, but they still had to be careful. In 1535, Henry threatened to kill Summers with his own bare hands for calling Anne Boleyn a ribald, which was a term that meant whore, and Princess Elizabeth a bastard. But it seems that he was forgiven because he continued to be Henry's fool. One more succession, and I'm showing this to show the change in the representation of children. This is by Anthony van Dyck and called The Five Eldest Children of Charles I, 1637. And it demonstrates the strength of the line of succession from Charles I. The painting was extremely popular. It was copied many times, and it's interesting, compared with the previous painting, to note the relative informality of the group compared with Edward's stiff pose. But Van Dyck has still maintained the royal status through the sumptuous clothes and setting. The important child here is the one in the centre, Charles. Here he's age 7 and he becomes Charles II, and he's shown in control of an enormous mastiff. The mastiff had been a guard dog since Roman times, and here it's being controlled by Charles, demonstrating his ability to control and therefore control the nation. The mastiff was actually an immensely popular breed because it was used in what was then regarded as a sport of bull and bear baiting. In fact, it was used to the extent that the mastiff at this point had become an endangered species, and it's being shown here because it's a status symbol, a rare and much desired breed. Incidentally, the child to the left is James, here age 4 and not yet breeched, which is why he's shown in a dress, later become James II. We jump forward 100 years to the reign of George II. This is William Hogarth's A Rake's Progress, the arrest. And we see coming out of the sedan chair Tom Rakewell, and he's arriving at St James's Palace, which you can see on the left. He's squandered his fortune to the extent that the bailiffs here are trying to arrest him, but his former betrothed, Sarah Young, although he rejected her, is still holding out a purse trying to pay off his debts. And you can see that she works as a seamstress because the box of her tools of the trade is falling down to the ground as she leaps forward, pulling back the bailiff and trying to pay off his debts. But however, I want to concentrate on the children though. There was much poverty in London, and many of the children had to fend for themselves. and become adults before their time. Bottom right, there's 7 children. And the children were actually added in a 3rd edition of the print, along with the flash of lightning. They're street urchins, fending for themselves, gambling, theft, small-scale business activities. First of all, the boy at the back, right at the back, is stealing Tom's handkerchief. The 2 boys in front of him are playing cards, but the boy wearing the wig is cheating, as his accomplice is behind the other one, looking at his cards and holding up 2 fingers. The boy being cheated is Mercury, which was a boy who sold newspapers in the street. And you can tell that from the horn stuck in his belt. And his cap reads, "Your vote and interest, liberties." The 2 baskets you can see on the left of centre and on the right are shoeblacks baskets. So that's another way the boys can make money. And there's a 3rd item used to make money. If you look at the boy on the left, he's smoking a pipe, reading the Farthing Post, which was a gossip sheet sold cheaply to avoid paying stamp duty. And in front of him, there's an inverted spirit glass and a small container. So he's selling unlicensed spirits, another way of making money. They're all boys, so you might wonder what opportunities there were for destitute girls in this harsh world. Well, there were very few opportunities other than prostitutions. They had to work mostly in factories, making matchboxes or sewing. Only 1 in 9 girls worked or could get jobs as domestic servants. The richer children were taught at home. Middle-class children went to grammar school or a private academy, but poor children like this had to work to support the family often. So these boys could be out on the street working to help support their families. So from poor children to loved children, these are Thomas Gainsborough's daughters. It's called The Painter's Daughters Chasing a Butterfly. It's his earliest portrait of his 2 daughters, Mary and Margaret, who were 5 and 6. Mary, who's the older one, the 6-year-old, is on the right, cool, poised, wise, restrained. Margaret was impulsive and heedless of danger. They're coming out of a dark wood, and the elder Mary looks wary and constrains the impetuous Margaret, who is leaping forward to try and capture this symbol of beauty, the butterfly, but is in danger of being pricked by one of the thorns of the thistle that the butterfly is resting on. So this symbolises impulsiveness versus constraint and the transience of human pleasures. It demonstrates as well what was then understood by the term sensibility, which in the 18th century became part of the cult of sensibility. Sensibility was associated with an appreciation of beauty and seeing the world with a sense of wonder and a strong emotional connection, an acute responsiveness towards the world. And these sensitive people were thought to have finer senses and to be more aware of beauty and moral truth. Although it could be taken to excess, in women, if taken to excess, it was called hysteria. So sensibility was widely seen to be a virtue, but it had its physical and emotional dangers. laid the groundwork for an art movement called the Romantic movement in art and literature. This is one of a pair of paintings by George Morland, and it makes the distinction between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, a distinction that I think some 40 years before William Hogarth had made with his series of prints called Industry and Idleness. This is the miseries of idleness, and you can see the idle husband can only provide his son with a bone to gnaw. The baby is in rags and crying. The empty cask and pitcher on its side suggest he's drunk, with the implication, therefore, that they only have themselves to blame for their impoverished state, and a tragic fate awaits them. On the other hand, these are the deserving poor and the comforts of industry. The hard-working husband has just come home to 3 well-fed children. He hands his wife some coins to provide for the family. Their clothes are clean and untorn, and the girl is holding a toy, a doll. The irony is that Morland was a notoriously heavy drinker and debtor. He spent his final years in debtor's prison, and he painted in prison. He could paint these works extremely quickly, and he would use them to pay off his debts, get out of debtor's prison, spend all of his money on drink and buying drinks for his friends, end up back in debtor's prison. He eventually died of alcoholism at age 41. His life, there were so many incidents in his life. It was so outrageous, so unbelievable, that 4 anecdotal biographies were written immediately after his death. I turn now to school. This is Thomas Webster's Late at School. 2 well-dressed children look in fear as they enter the school late, the sister trying to hide behind her brother. The earliest schools, this is 1835, this was painted, were associated with the church and became known as public schools, as they were open to the public. The alternative at the time was a private tutor. Now, in the Tudor period, charity schools emerged with the purpose of educating the poor, and Edward VI created a system of free grammar schools. In practice, poor children needed to work to support their family, so could rarely attend these free schools. And then coming up to the 18th and 19th century, the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge founded many charity schools for the poor, and this became the basis of today's concept of what we call primary and secondary school education. And in the 19th century, the Church of England sponsored most formal education, and in fact resisted attempts by the state to provide secular education until the government insisted and provided free compulsory education towards the end of the century. Now this school, this little village school here, is probably a Church of England school, as you might be thinking it's a ragged school. They were just getting started. There were only 3 in 1835 when this was painted, but by 1881 there were over 200, and some 300,000 children had been educated in these free so-called ragged schools. And we've come to the 1840s, known as the Hungry Forties, because of their poor harvests. But the situation in Ireland was even worse. Ireland was then a part of the United Kingdom, but more than 1 million people died of starvation in what was called the Great Famine from 1845 to 1852, and 1.5 million people emigrated. It's about a third of the population died or emigrated. This has been called, the Great Famine has been called the greatest social disaster of 19th century Europe, an event with something like the characteristics of a low-level nuclear attack. This painting is by George Frederick Watts and shows the horror of the Irish famine. What made things worse in Ireland is that the population depended on potatoes, and for good reason. The potato gave the highest yield of food per acre of any crop. But in 1845 there was a blight, a potato blight, that destroyed the crop and got worse from year to year. It was reported, it was known about in England, it was reported in the Illustrated London News, for example. The artist, the Illustrated London News had an artist who toured Ireland reporting on what he saw, and that alerted the British public to the crisis, but the government did nothing. In fact, the real outrage was that there was enough grain being exported from Ireland throughout the famine to feed the entire population. And this painting shows the effect of famine in England, because there was famine in England as well as Ireland. It was much worse in Ireland. But one of the effects of the famine in England was emigration. And this shows the emigrants' last sight of home. And this is Leith Hill, where the artist Richard Redgrave owned a cottage and spent a lot of time there each summer. And he was one of the pioneers of what's called social realist paintings, paintings of the poor and needy. As a result of the Industrial Revolution, there was widespread unemployment in the 1830s and 40s. There were poor harvests, as I've said, and there were also corn laws which held the price of bread higher than it should have been. And one result of all of this was mass emigration from Britain to the colonies and to America. There was another reason, another incentive to leave, and that was the discovery of gold in Australia and America and the possibility of making a fortune. And aside from gold, there was the promise of farming land and higher wages. In this painting, the father has a carpenter's bag, so he's got a skill, described at the time by a critic as a modern Joseph escaping with his family to a new land and life. But underneath you can see the family's sadness, although perhaps also hope that things will turn out better, a sense of optimism. The sadness is a result of leaving friends behind. Notice halfway down the hill there's a boy standing with the help of crutches. He looks sad, and notice that the girl is at the top is holding up a cloth, her apron, to her face. Perhaps she's stopping herself crying. Her sister, standing behind her, is pointing to the boy, so we can imagine that she's leaving behind the boy she loves. A father is waving his hat at someone down the bottom of the hill while his wife looks up to him unhappy, and her young daughter has her face nestled in her lap, perhaps crying. Emigration was often heartbreaking, because of leaving one's country and breaking personal relationships. The workhouse. This is John Brett's Stonebreaker. And we return here to the rural poor and the workhouse, introduced in 1834 with the Poor Law Amendment Act. The aim of the workhouse was to reduce the cost to the ratepayer of paying poor relief. And the idea was that the conditions in the workhouse would be worse than the worst conditions of working, to force people to work rather than to enter the workhouse. But conditions in factories were so bad that despite every effort to make conditions worse in the workhouse, it turned out to be almost impossible. The conditions were appalling in both factories and the workhouse, and in the workhouse it gave rise to scandals reported in the press. Stone breaking was one occupation given to those in the workhouse. It was soul-destroying task, although Brett here shows what looks like a well-nourished, smartly dressed boy accompanied by a playful dog in a sunlit, beautiful setting. So it's difficult to know the message he's trying to get across. This, by the way, is the Mole Valley, and the hill the other side of the valley is Box Hill. The milestone shows London is 23 miles away. There's, over on the right, you can just about see a railway bridge and embankment in the middle distance. Look, and down the bottom of the hill you can see St Michael's Church. We're on the hill, or just along from the hill, where we now have Denby's Vineyard, and Dorking is to the right. And every detail of the Surrey Valley is captured with scientific accuracy, which John Brett was known for. John Ruskin, in fact, said that Brett went beyond anything the Pre-Raphaelites have done in terms of the detail. He worked on this picture outdoors, we know. He painted a few additions in the studio. The boy was modelled on his brother Edwin. The blasted tree perhaps signifies the boy's blasted future. But if you look on the top of the tree, there's a bird, a bullfinch, symbolising the free human spirit. So there's a mixed message here with the sunlight, but the blasted tree. So perhaps it's ambiguous about what the future of the boy will be. Switching to a very different theme. Fairy stories. We've reached the middle of the 19th century, and at this time we have some of the first stories written specifically for children, although many of the early fairy stories were fairly gruesome. They were actually written for adults. And it all started in the 17th century with a French author, Charles Perrault, and he was one of the earliest to assemble these ancient fairy tales. You may be thinking of the Brothers Grimm, Jacob and Wilhelm. They were later, and they assembled a book of German folklore, and it became extremely popular. So it's better known than Charles Perrault. This is a version of Perrault's fairy tale of Red Riding Hood. The illustration is by Gustave Doré, published in 1862, and in the book, which is available online, Red Riding Hood is only 6 pages long, fairly short. It includes 3 large illustrations. This is one of them. And in his version, the wolf meets Red Riding Hood in the woods, and she innocently tells him where she's going and where her grandmother lives. So the wolf hurries on ahead, eats the grandmother, and when Red Riding Hood arrives, he's in the bed wearing her bonnet, asks her to join him in the bed, which we see here, then eats her, and that's the end of the story. Remember, the original fairy stories were folk tales passed on from adult to adult, and they had a moral meaning, which I'll tell you in a moment. Just to mention that it was later the brothers Grimm toned down the story and added a hunter who comes to the rescue, cuts open the wolf with an axe, rescues Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother, who emerge unscathed, and they fill the wolf's body with stones. A strange twist here, he wakes up, goes to try and drink from the well, and because of the stones he falls in and drowns. Returning to this version by Perrault, after commenting on her grandmother's big arms, big legs, big ears and big eyes, it ends with the famous lines, "Grandma, what big teeth you have, the better to eat you with." And saying these words, the wicked wolf fell upon poor Little Red Riding Hood and ate her all up. But what's interesting is the story then ends with a moral, which I'll read in full because it explains what these fairy stories were actually about. It was a warning to young women. And it's headed The Moral. Children, girls most of all, so sweet, so pretty, so innocent and nice. Don't listen to everyone you meet. But if you do, don't be surprised when it's you the wolf means to eat. I say wolf, as there are many kinds. Some seem mild-mannered, benign, without wrath, smooth and refined, who follow girls from time to time. These wolves are the most dangerous kind. So as you can see, it's not actually about a wolf eating a girl. It's about a girl being seduced by a man. Innocence. Now, as I said, in the early representations of children, in the early culture, children were seen as small adults. This idea of childhood being a special period of innocence and beauty where children are cute and precious and vulnerable and need to be looked after by vigilant adult supervision, this is created in the 19th century. Now, what we see here is John Everett Millais, his 5-year-old daughter Effie, posing for him. She's sitting, in fact, on one of the high-backed pews in All Saints Church, Kingston-on-Thames. And Millais hurried to paint these pews in 1862, shortly before they were removed and destroyed. Critics described this as one of the happiest works this artist has ever painted. It's my first sermon. It was exhibited in 1863. And the Millais painted a companion piece a year later. This one, my second sermon, exhibited at the Royal Academy a year later. And interestingly, in his speech at the Royal Academy banquet, the Archbishop of Canterbury claimed it as a warning against the evil of lengthy sermons and drowsy discourses, blaming, of course, the vicars rather than the child. One critic noted, "Everybody is rejoiced to recognise, sitting in the same place as last year, a little girl now dear to many a heart, who then was listening in rapt attention." And both images were widely reproduced as prints. And this print and many others of his work made him one of, in fact, the wealthiest artist of the 19th century. Just to briefly mention photography and what's now regarded as one of the greatest photographers of the 19th century. this revolutionary work by Julia Margaret Cameron, pushing the artistic boundaries of photography before those boundaries had even been established. Incidentally, she left no mark on photography in the 19th century and was only rediscovered in 1948, but has become seen as one of the leading photographers. The American photographer Imogen Cunningham said, "I'd like to see portrait photography go right back to Julia Margaret Cameron. I don't think there's anyone better." And Getty Images commented recently, "Cameron's photographic portraits are considered amongst the finest in the early history of photography." Julia Margaret Cameron, only came to photography late. Her daughter gave her first camera, and this is the first print with which she was satisfied. It's Annie Philpott, the daughter of a local villager. This is Bubbles, again by John Everett Millais. By 1886, he was the most famous and wealthiest artist in the country and lived in a very grand house in Kensington. It's based on early 17th century Danish vanitas paintings, pointing out, those vanitas paintings pointed out the transience of life. And that's illustrated here by the plant in the background, which is dying, the broken pot in the foreground on the left, and the bubble about to burst, showing the shortness of life. It was bought by the owner of the Illustrated London News. It was reproduced in the Illustrated London News, and it was seen in that paper by the managing director of Pears Soap, then called A&F Pears. He convinced Millais to give up rights to the painting. He was worried about being exploited, but he finally agreed. And in fact, this was the campaign, and Millais was happy with the campaign. Barrett or Pears Soap spent £30,000 on the campaign, and there were millions of reproductions, and they would hang in homes around the country. The child, by the way, is Millais' grandson, William Milbourne James, and he was dogged by the image throughout his life, and he became known as, his nickname became Bubbles, although that didn't stop him becoming an admiral, a politician and an author. And it wasn't until 9 years later that this commercial, this advertisement, was criticised in a novel, and the artist was criticised for prostituting his talent. And it was clear to everyone that the artist she was referring to was Millais, and he defended himself by saying he'd sold the copyright, so couldn't control the use. And this novel and Millais' response aroused an argument in the art world that was reported in the press, and then artists started to protest against this use of fine art. And the argument continued into the 20th century about should fine art be used in this way, until probably the time of pop art and Andy Warhol, who effectively united or made it clear that there's no distinction between fine art and mass marketing. Final work by Millais, The Boyhood of Raleigh. This time capturing the wonders of adventure and discovery. And this is Millais imagining the boyhood of Raleigh, who, of course, was one of the most celebrated explorers of the Elizabethan age. He's the boy in green, listening with rapt attention to the wonders of the the sailors' adventures on sea and land. It's a Genoese sailor. The painting again went into print. It was extremely popular. It was seen as a celebration of the British Empire and our control of the seas through the power of the Royal Navy. The barefoot sailor points out across the horizon. A model ship lies on one side. Its red flag, by the way, is not an ensign, I don't think, as it doesn't have the small cross of St. George, which was used in the Elizabethan period. It's probably the red flag raised to indicate a ship is about to engage in combat. The boy's expression shows their concentration. We can imagine they're thinking of the exotic world conjured up by the sailor, and these exotic worlds are indicated by the wicker basket covered in exotic feathers and the two birds next to it behind the anchor. One is a toucan from South America. Happy childhood. I think this is a wonderful illustration. It's called Three Happy Boys. Francis Meadow Sutcliffe was an English photographer who's spent a lot of time recording the everyday life of the townsfolk of the seaside town of Whitby. And he was born in Leeds and had a basic education, became a portrait photographer in Tunbridge Wells, and then moved to Whitby for the rest of his life. So he was a resident, he lived in Whitby. His father was a painter, introduced him to John Ruskin, so he was known in the art world. Now he was a bit different. He made money by taking photographs of holidaymakers, but regarded it as prostituting his art, and so he hated the money-making side and spent a lot of his own time building up one of the most complete and revealing collections of photographs of late Victorian England. Mary Cassatt was an American artist, but she lived much of her life in France. She was a friend of Edgar Degas, exhibited with the Impressionists, often painted the social and private lives of women, particularly with children. She came from a wealthy family, and when she moved to Paris, she was chaperoned by her mother and a family friend. Because she was a woman, she wasn't accepted at the École des Beaux-Arts, and she studied privately, was very highly regarded by the Impressionists, but found that it was very difficult to get her work accepted for exhibitions because it was expected that they would only be accepted for an exhibition if they had friends on the jury. And the way that a woman obtained friends on the jury was to flirt with the jurors, which she refused to do. But she came from a wealthy background, so she was financially independent. And she was invited to exhibit at the Impressionist exhibitions. From about the age of 44, 1888, many of the works she produced were paintings of mother and child. And her reputation today is mainly based on those late paintings of mother and child. In fact, from 1890, it was almost exclusively mother and child paintings, inspired by the Italian Renaissance pictures of Madonna and child. This is an unusual angle, looking down on the mother and child, inspired, as many artists were at the time, by Japanese prints. Incidentally, the authorities called on people to bathe regularly as a medical prevention to prevent the disease, because cholera was rampant. So the mother and child here are not playing in a bath, but they have serious expressions, indicating this is a solemn, even spiritual occasion. It's a bit like the Virgin Mary washing Christ's feet. This is La Vie, the life, a great masterpiece of Picasso's blue period. Picasso said, "I started to paint in blue when I learned of Casagemus's death." Carlos Casagemus was his good friend who'd committed suicide. He'd fallen in love with Germaine Pichot, a model and friend of both of them, Picasso and Casagemus. But she wanted nothing to do with him. She refused to live with him. And then he took a revolver to a cafe where she was having dinner, and he shot at her but missed, and then shot himself and killed himself. He died in hospital later that evening. Picasso was then 21. He was actually he'd gone back to Madrid. He returned to Paris, desperately poor, suffered from depression because of his friend's death, and started painting in blue themes of misery and poverty of the lower classes. This painting is hard to interpret. It's been seen in many ways. The man looks like a portrait of Carlos Casagemus. He's pointing to a woman and her baby, but is close to another woman, possibly the same woman, Germaine. Is he dreaming of the future that might have been? Previously, there's an underpainting. Picasso painted over a bearded man on the right, and he painted this woman holding a baby. Why did he change it? One idea is it represents sacred and profane love. Another is that it's a cycle of life, starting with the baby, then the young lover on the left, then the mature woman with the baby on the right, and then the old woman, which is the drawing low down. There's another idea discussed by critics about this painting. If you look at the man's gesture, it looks very similar to the gesture of Christ in Correggio's Noli me tangere, 1525. Latin means "do not touch me," but is better translated from the Greek "cease holding on to me," in the sense of let go, both that now that he's purely spiritual and so no physical contact is possible. Cease holding on to me mentally, let me go. This is after First World War. The artist is Kathy Kollwitz and shows the effect of the First World War on children. Her son died in the First World War, and she worked with Otto Dix creating anti-war propaganda. She wanted to show the horrors of war at a time when pro-war sentiment was growing in Germany. After the war, she finished her 3 most famous portraits, posters, including this one, Germany's Children Starving. And it was the image of starving children in Germany that inspired Eglantine Jebb to found Save the Children in April 1919. There was an Allied naval blockade to prevent food reaching Germany, and Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. And that blockade is estimated to result in the death by starvation of 50,000 to 750,000 civilians. 100,000 of them died of starvation after the war had ended because the Allies refused to remove the blockade. Jebb's Save the Children appeal was suddenly and dramatically successful, despite the fact that she was raising money for the former enemy. The public donated over £1 million, and she got the blockade raised. And during the 1920s, she devoted herself to Save the Children and died in 1928, aged only 52. This is Hilda, Unity and Dolls by Stanley Spencer, painted 3 months after his divorce from Hilda. And it captures her grief. She's not looking at us, but her and his daughter, 7-year-old Unity, is staring straight out at us, maybe challenging us with her gaze and her recriminations. But the dolls are interesting. The eyeless dolls seem heighten the painting's sense of loss and dislocation. Art critics have discussed for years the idea that Unity poked out the eyes of the doll. In fact, we now know that's not true, because one of the dolls, Golden Slumbers Sonia Rose it was called, was shown at the Henley Literary Festival in 2015 by a then 85-year-old Unity. She still had the doll. The doll still had working, undamaged eyes that opened and closed. So it was Spencer. He'd painted the eyes of both dolls as black sockets, perhaps reinforcing the piercing, accusing stare of his daughter Unity. In contrast, we see here a happy family. This is Norman Rockwell's Freedom from Want, 1943. His best known picture of a happy family in America. And it's the third of what he called the 4 Freedoms series of paintings. And those 4 freedoms were inspired by a State of the Union address by Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1941. They were the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And Roosevelt said the third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. So in those days, America saw its goal was to bring those 4 freedoms to the whole world. And in fact, they became incorporated in the Charter of the United Nations. A different representation of a holiday scene. This is called The Last Resort. It's one of 40 photographs taken in New Brighton, which is a beach suburb of Liverpool. And what Martin Parr is doing is showing how leisure time is spent. He shows different leisure activities, a lot of them on the beach. He likes recording the beach. The beach is always going to be an integral part of what I do. It just goes on, he says. Incidentally, at New Brighton, most of the golden sands had gone in the 1960s because of tidal changes in the Mersey, and there was a lot of concrete and large pieces of haulage machinery, and people had to put towels down on the concrete because there was no sand, and as an alternative to deck chairs. It was an area which was used by the economically deprived working class of Liverpool, and Parr shows their life, warts and all. It was criticised at the time. Some critics thought it was cruel and voyeuristic. In fact, Parr said it's very easy to look back and be nostalgic, thinking that everything was better in the good old days. Well, it wasn't. It just evolves. Adoration of the Cage Fighters is the first in a series of 6 tapestries called The Vanity of Small Differences by Grayson Perry, based on Andrea Mantegna's The Adoration of the Shepherds, a 15th century painting. And the series concerns social mobility, and it's also a 21st century response to Hogarth's Rake's Progress of the 18th century. And Perry has reversed the story and tells the life of Tim Rakewell rather than Tom Rakewell. This is the first tapestry of the series, and in this Tim is still a baby, reaching out to grab his mother's smartphone. It's set in Tim's great-grandmother's front room. We see her sitting in the background. His mother is dressed to go out. 4 friends on the right are waiting for her, and a pair of martial art cage fighters rather than shepherds are kneeling before Tim with presents of tribal identity, a Sunderland AFC football shirt and a miner's lamp. Tim, incidentally, if you look on the far right, is on the stairs as a 4-year-old, facing the evening alone with the television. The mother's words are written around, difficult to read here, but written around the red outline, and I won't read them all, but they include the words, we were a normal family, a divorce or two, mental illness, addiction, domestic violence, the usual thing. My friends, they keep me sane, take me out, listen. A night out of the weekend in town is a precious ritual. Finally, I wanted to end with a recent work of art concerned with children in one of the current major conflicts. This is Banksy mural, we believe, in Borodyanka, Ukraine. It's sprayed on the wall of a missile-damaged kindergarten. The image, by the way, has since been turned into a stamp in Ukraine. In November 2022, Banksy posted this photo and 6 others set in Ukraine, and it shows the Russian leader Vladimir Putin being thrown by a child. A reference, I think, to the biblical story of David and Goliath, representing Ukraine and Russia, of course. We still don't know the identity of Banksy. He's a Bristol-born artist. He's been active since the 1990s. And, of course, just to mention Putin's well-known sport or favourite sport is judo, but he was stripped of his taekwondo black belt and his honorary judo title by the International Judo Federation in March 2022. I've shown you how children were regarded from ancient Egypt to the present day. And just to end with something that John F. Kennedy said, children are the living message we send to a time we will not see. Thank you.